It has been a minute since I have stood in a pulpit and seen Mr. Elmore in the back smiling at me. That's a treat. I want to thank everybody for being here and all the encouragement from the elders in coming and participating. Just before services, Eric came down with a smile on his face and leaned down in a very fatherly way and said, "Don't mess up." And I understood that to mean I love you. That's just his way of saying that. But after JP's sermon this morning, it's okay because he won't hold it against me if I do mess up. No resentment. Thank you all for several things. We've been coming down and visiting with you for about a year and a half, ever since our oldest son came down for his freshman year. He's halfway through his second year. And several months after he moved down, he placed membership here. And thank you all for that. Thank you for the elders for taking him in and shepherding him. And he was excited when he met Josh. And he was excited when he realized JP was going to be here. And then Isaac, who I've known since, you were 9? I think you were 9, which makes me old. When I met Isaac at camp for the first time. Thank you all for that. And I really wish I could have been like a fly on the wall as Keenan was visiting with the elders and talking about coming here. We tried to prepare him for choosing a church family when he left home. This is the first place that he has chosen as an adult, and we're so excited that he did. We tried to prepare him for that. We moved to Louisville just about 3 years ago and placed membership at a congregation, and Anna and I had the conversation with the elders there. And then afterwards, I pulled them aside and said, "Look, Keenan is in his teens, and I want to prepare him for this. Would you guys talk to him on your own without telling him that I talked to you?" And on a Wednesday night, one of our elders came up to Keenan after services and clapped his hand on his back and said, "Keenan, we would like to talk to you in the back for a minute." And Keenan looked really scared, and as he turned around, I heard the elders say, "So, how many times have you been married?" I love that man. I love that man. I'm sure it went much smoother here. So thank you all for being a church family for our oldest and for so many others. Thank you for that. Let's make sure we've got this going here and that I've got it going the right direction. There we are. We're going to do 2 different things tonight. Like Eric mentioned, I work with a nonprofit, a group of men and women that travel overseas and travel to the Bible lands, and we try to create resources to help people come to understand their Bible better, to help them come to faith or to reinforce their faith. There are some people who have a lot of questions, and hopefully, as we explore the Bible lands and bring context to what they're reading, we'll remove some of the hurdles, some of the barriers to their understanding. And we've been doing that since about 2016. And any number of us that work on that team can get up and do for you what I'm doing tonight. Dan is here with his family, one of our team members. You've got a couple of our team members' kids here. I'm going to mention to Barry, you didn't mention his name, Eric. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to share with you a few minutes and a few photos from our most recent trip this last October. We have done a series on the life of Christ called Following the Messiah. We've done a series Searching for a King, where you're looking at the United Kingdom, so Saul, David, and Solomon. Most recently, a couple of years ago, we released something on an introduction to Revelation called Trial and Triumph. So it takes you through the first 3 chapters of Revelation. However, what we decided to do was to go back into the Old Testament and tell one of the most crucial stories that ties so much of our Bibles together, because it's a story of redemption. And even in our Bible class this morning here in the auditorium at university, the teacher was talking about how much of the imagery from Exodus was used in Revelation. And he's right. All of that imagery is all the way through. So the better you understand the story of the Exodus and God's redemptive power and deliverance, the better you'll understand the message of the gospel. Because the Israelites' deliverance is a message that relates to our deliverance from sin and death. And so we traveled to Israel, and it was our longest trip. We left the States on the 2nd of October, and we got home, it seems like, on the 16th. So what you're looking at there is a map that my brother put together for his kids so they could track him every single day of the trip and know where he was. And we all shared it with our families, and I think it made it on social media. So on the 3rd, we arrived in Cairo, and we kind of backtracked a little bit. We went to a Cairo marketplace and then Tel El Daba, which is a little bit north, which is where they believe Goshen was, where the Israelites were living at the time. We went on a Nile River boat which was a lot of fun, and then we caught an overnight train ride south to Luxor. And ask our team members about that. We were trying to travel by as many different ways as we could, and one of our co-founders said, we really need to take this train ride, and it's going to be amazing. We're going to get the top of the line travel car. It's a sleeper car. It'll be great. Look at the pictures, and he showed us the pictures. And when we got to the train station, we got nervous, and when we saw all the people sitting on luggage, we got really nervous, and then when we got on the train, it was not like the pictures. And none of us ever want to travel by train again. One person slept, but it's because he passed out. The rest of us stayed awake that whole night. But we made it down to Luxor. We spent some time there. We ended up catching a flight over to the Sinai Peninsula, and we were there for several days. We ended up hiking to the top of Jebel Musa. We have some pictures of that, which is one of the traditional locations for Mount Sinai. So we drove up to about an elevation of 5,000 feet, hiked 2,500 feet, and spent the night up top. When we came back down, we took a ferry ride across the eastern finger of the Red Sea into Jordan. We got there at Aqaba, spent several days in Wadi Rum, spent some time in Petra, made it up to Amman, Jordan, and traveled over to Mount Nebo, where Moses concluded his journey with the Israelites, because we know that's where he passed away, looking into the promised land from the top of Mount Nebo. And so that's where we wrapped up our trip and then went back to Amman and flew home. So some of the pictures that we have of that, that's our team. That's actually the largest team we've ever taken on a production trip, and that's just the U.S. team. We had to have a local production team with us, both in Egypt and in Jordan, so we had to have almost a person-to-person ratio. So if there were 9 of us from the U.S., we had to have a team of 9 from Egypt and close to a team of 9 from Jordan accompanying us. And then those are some of the things that we saw that we'll hopefully be sharing later on in this year. That is a sunrise over Wadi Rum. And then you have a gentleman who is helping us on this boat on the Nile River. A lot of the folks work multi-generational jobs there. So if you ask this gentleman, hey, how long have you been doing this job? He'll say, well, my father taught me and his father taught him, and he'll lose track of how many generations have been doing that job. The gentleman there on the lower right, we had just finished doing another shoot, and we were driving through the countryside, a part of Egypt that tourists usually don't go through. And we saw a family baking their week's worth of bread in an oven in the front yard. It was a mud brick oven. And we passed it, and I said, hey. And we backed up, and all these Americans piled out, and the family was like, what is going on? And we're like, tell us about your bread. And they're like, the bread? We're like, yeah, the bread. How do you make it? What do you use with it? Blah, blah, blah. And they ended up giving us several loaves of bread for free. And they ended up bringing out some cheese for us to put on the bread. You can't tell it very well, but there's a teenage girl in a yellow shirt that was so nervous she didn't want to be in the photo. Her parents were like, come on, get in the picture with the Americans. And she's like, no. And the young man is just thrilled. We ended up getting to Jebel Musa, Mount Sinai. We ended up starting our hike much later than we had planned. There were several reasons for that we can share later. But our goal was to climb the 2,500 feet so that we could shoot the sunset, spend the night, and then shoot the sunrise. And because it took us so long to start the ascent, we were losing sunlight. And so we're like, we just have to get there in time to see the sun. We just have to get there. And so we were shooting for little bits of time, and then they would turn the cameras off, and then we would go. And then they would shoot, and then we would go. And this is one of those times where like, just go. And Dan and I are the tail end of the group. We're exhausted. Those are posted smiles, like our chest was heaving. You're climbing 2,500 feet in approximately 3 miles, which is pretty steep. Towards the end, there's a final section of 750 steps. And they are not steps like you see leading up to the stage. They are uneven steps, they're rough steps, pretty far apart sometimes. You could break an ankle if you're not careful. And we had to climb the 750 steps, and he's like, this is it, you're almost there. We're like, this is going to kill us. We asked our guide just to make small talk and maybe slow him down. We tried to get him talking. We're like, if you're not escorting tourists, how quickly can you make this hike? And he said, I can make it in about 45 minutes on my own. And we said, how long would it take you to come down? And he said, 30. On this path. And we said, there are other paths? And he said, yeah, there's another path on the other side of the mountain that has 3,000 of these steps. 3,000 of these steps called the steps of repentance. And we're like, you just lobbed that out there. Because you start and repent and turn around and come down. The Bedouins there are amazing. They are so gracious. They are so in shape. They do such a good job taking care of us. For another perspective, that's looking back down, and that's not all the way down. That's only about halfway down. And those are crew members, and if you haven't thought about this yet, think about crew and carrying gear. I've met several people this week that have said, hey, I know you, I've recognized you, I've watched some of your stuff, I've seen you. Yeah, you've seen me, but you don't see everybody else. It takes a lot of people to do what we do, and it's not all super glamorous stuff. And these guys aren't even carrying the bulk of the gear. The local guys are carrying the bulk of the gear. And at this hike, they gave up and loaded up a couple of camels and donkeys and made them carry the equipment. But these guys are carrying because they want to shoot on the way. So they've got themselves plus their equipment. And then my view most of the day is that. A bunch of guys in really weird, awkward poses, clumped together in a mass, talking and shooting. That's most of us right there. We're just missing a couple. Dan, you might be off taking pictures somewhere, which Dan does a lot. Probably the highlight of the trip was sleeping under the stars at the top of Mount Sinai. And we had planned that. We had asked them, do many people sleep up there? And they said, not very many. Most people have such a tight schedule. The park is open 24/7, and people will park in the parking lot at 12, 1 a.m., hike up to get to the top before the sunrise, take pictures of the sunrise, buy a trinket, and then hike back down. And then they're on to do their next thing or get some sleep. And so we asked, hey, could we pay you to make us a meal at the top? And they had some huts to offer us to sleep in, but it was only in the 40s. And maybe here in Florida, you're like them over there. They're like, it's freezing. You're going to die from hypothermia. And we're like, we have jackets and wool blankets. Can we just sleep out here? And they let us sleep under the stars. And I wish it was a darker picture, but it was a full moon that night, so it was super bright. But it was gorgeous, and most of us did not sleep much, just because of where we were and what we were thinking about. In the middle of the night, I walked down, and those are the last 50 steps or so from about where we were sleeping to the top of Mount Sinai. And so you can kind of see those stars, especially off to the left, and imagine going up that. And then Dan and I actually went up together. The other guy stayed in a different place, but Dan and I went up to the Outlook, and that was the sunrise from the top of Sinai, which was an incredible experience. And you're there with everybody else who was hiked up for that experience. And there were people up there. It was fascinating to me, the people that came up. We met a gentleman who had a bad knee, and he made it up hobbling with a cane. There was a woman with a child that was under 2 years old, and she carried that child to the top of that. There was a gentleman from Israel who was raised Jewish and is now agnostic, and he came to Mount Sinai. And if you ask him, what are you doing up here? If you're agnostic or even atheist, why are you coming? He's like, because the story means so much. He's not wrong. And so you meet all of these people that are coming up to try to capture part of the experience of Moses and the Israelites. And there's something to that. Eventually, we had to go down the mountain and get on the ferry and leave Egypt. And we'll see if that will play or if I have to back up. Nope, that's it. It's actually a little video clip. That's the sunset on Egypt as we're crossing over into Jordan. And think about what that must have been for the Israelites to look back on a closed body of water separating them from where they had been oppressed for so long. Eventually, When we were in Jordan, we made it to Petra. Most of you recognize that from Indiana Jones, not from anything else, but I took it because everyone knew what that would be. But we paid a little bit extra. They let us into Petra before the park actually opened, and they let us go and see that before anybody else saw it, but it was just a couple of minutes because people started flooding in pretty quickly. But that is sunrise at Petra. The sun is coming up, but it's beyond where we were. The city of Petra at night, which is gorgeous. And then we ended up finishing. That is a panorama from the top of Nebo. So if this is what you're looking at. If you see the glare beneath the sun, the glare on the ground, that's actually the sun's reflection on the Dead Sea. It is so salty, and it is so slimy, and it is so gross. I have floated in the Dead Sea. Dan, I think we got you in there too. And if you move from your left to your right, about halfway across that picture, beyond the Jordan Rift Valley, it's hard to see because of the haze, we could make out Jericho. And then when you think about what God showed Moses before he passed, as he was standing at the top, the vision that he had of the land of Israel on a clear day. And all of us were looking into Israel, anticipating the fulfillment of God's promise. Now, coinciding with the trip, last half of last year, there was a class at our local congregation that a friend and I were teaching on the parables of Jesus. And so, as you're studying and preparing for things, you see connections in certain places. And as I was making this trip, especially when we were around Mount Sinai, I made a connection for the first time between Moses and Jesus and a parable. And I want you to turn in your Bibles over to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. And there's a lot in this chapter. We'll try to make some textual connections quickly and then make some application that I hope will be helpful. When you go back and you read Exodus, you realize that Moses was at Mount Sinai when God revealed himself to him in the burning bush. Because he told him to go and get the Israelites and to bring them back to this mountain and worship me on this mountain. And as we were leaving Jebel Musa for the last time, which is pretty arid, there's not a whole lot there, there was this singular bush on the hillside that I took a picture of. And I thought, Moses with his flocks near Mount Sinai. There's not a whole lot there. I'm sure there were some greener places, but when I think of a shepherd and I think of sheep, I think of what I live around. I think about the rolling hills of Kentucky and the Ohio River Valley. Or I think about where I grew up in the Willamette Valley out in Oregon. And I think about these lush lands that livestock can live on. And that was not the experience of Moses. And I was thinking about all of that as I was also thinking about parables. Think about Luke chapter 15. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, in verse 1. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." I want you to think about the context and the setting. Jesus is coming and he's preaching the arrival of the kingdom. John the Baptist has been going ahead of him doing that, but the kingdom is here. The one they've been looking for has arrived. And there's a group of people that recognize something about Jesus and are drawn toward him. They're tax collectors and sinners. And the people that see themselves as better than that, in verse 2, take issue with it. In verse 2, they grumble. Look at who this man spends time with. Look at who he hangs out. Look at who comes near him. He receives sinners and eats with them. And then in answer to that, Jesus teaches a string of 3 parables, back to back to back, and ties them all together. Similar in structure, similar in message, but the message intensifies through the string of 3 stories. And he starts in verse 3, so he told them this parable. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost.' Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance." And in my head, when I imagined that, I always imagined a very fertile setting, gentle rolling hills, like he's going out in the morning mist and he comes back like 3 hours later. It's no big deal, and everyone's partying. But after hiking up that trail 2,500 feet in 3 miles and racing the sunset on one day, Moses was in shape. He was like my Bedouin friend who could do it in 45 minutes and come down in 30. And what Jesus says is that when this shepherd finds the one who's lost, he doesn't just lead it along. It's possible that it was injured or it's dehydrated, something's wrong with it. He slings it over his shoulders and carries a burden to bring him back to the rest of the sheep. Think about the effort that Jesus is saying this shepherd expended for 1% of his flock. And so we see this formula as we go through the text. Many people refer to Luke chapter 15 as the lost chapter of the Bible because you have these 3 different things that are lost. The first is the sheep. 1% of the flock, and the shepherd searches diligently. He leaves the safety of the others. He leaves the comfort of the others. He goes out into the open country. He searches diligently. He ends up finding him. When he finds him, he slings him on his shoulder. He rejoices that he's found the one, and then he invites others to share in his joy. This one could have perished, but share in my joy. And then you get to the shorter story, the parable of the lost coin. Verse 8, "What woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses 1 coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost.' Just so I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents." And you have a similar formula. You have this woman who loses 10% of what she had, 1 out of 10 coins. She searches diligently. And before I go on, have you ever searched diligently for something? And to what extreme did you go to find it? She is tossing her house upside down. Years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, I had gone to the bank, and this is before mobile deposits. You would go to the bank with a paper check and give it to them. Kids, are you listening? You're like, why would you do that? Because you wouldn't get paid if you didn't go to the bank. And you would give them the check, and you give them the deposit slip, and they would run it through, and they would give you a receipt for your deposit that would tell you the amount, and then you take it home. I never kept those receipts. It's a waste of killing trees. And so I made the deposit, and I got in the car, and I went home, and a couple of days later, logged into my account, and there was no deposit. And I went back to the bank, the same teller that I saw every week, and I said, "Hey, I made this deposit," and it was like a 4-figure deposit. "I don't see the money in my account." And so she pulls up the screen, and she's like, "No, you never made that deposit." I was like, "I made that deposit." She's like, "Show me the check." I was like, "You took the check. I don't have the check." She's like, "Do you have the receipt?" I was like, "Who keeps the receipts?" She's like, "Then you don't have the money." Guess what I did when I went home? I turned that house upside down. Guess where I found the receipt? In the second to last trash bag that I'd taken out. I opened up the trash bag and dug through the trash to find the receipt, and it was probably gross. And I was like, I'm taking this into the bank. And so I took that gross receipt to that teller, flipped it over, and went, there it is. She went, oh. And she had to go through the last week's transactions until she found it. I was not going to be out 4 figures. That's money. It's only money. Jesus is talking about something worth infinitely more than a dollar sign. He's talking about the soul of someone created in the image of God that's going to be lost. And to what extent will someone go? And when you realize the value of what has been lost, when it's finally found, isn't it appropriate to rejoice and invite others to do the same? And he's giving us a glimpse into things that we don't get to see. Because he concludes every single time by saying, this is what is going on in heaven when one soul is found. And then we get to the longest story, which is the parable of the prodigal, starting in verse 11, going through verse 32. And we're not going to go into great detail with it. We don't have time for that tonight. But take time to do that. You know the story. Because the parables shift. The very first parable, you have an animal. It's just an animal. And in the second story, you have a coin. It's just an inanimate object. It's just a coin. But in the third parable, you have a person. And the ratio shifts from 1 to 10 to 50. But it's just one person. And it's not just one person that's a good person. It's a person that is arrogant and hostile toward his father. You understand that culturally, this young man is going to his dad and saying, I'm not waiting for you to die. Give me what you owe me now while you're still alive. How insulting that would be. How much that would hurt the heart of the father. And if you were that father, how would you be tempted to respond? I know some dads, and I'm going to steal a dad joke, some dads would say, do you see this pile of sand? Pound it. That's my answer. Do you see those rocks? Kick them. That's not what this father did. This father liquidated what he needed to liquidate and gave the son what was his. With no parameters. He didn't tell him how to use it. The son went out and wasted it. He traveled far away from home, far away from anyone who would know him, did what he wanted to do, and it was gone. And then the circumstances changed. Not only was his money gone, but the circumstances around him got harder. There was a famine. And this Jewish boy, far from home, started working for a pig farmer to the point that he was willing to eat the food of the pigs. But eventually, in verse 17, a turning point happens when it says he came to himself. He woke up. And he started to think logically and spiritually about his situation and said, look, how many of my father's hired servants, the ones back home, have more than enough bread, and I'm sitting here perishing with hunger? And he plans out a speech. I'm going to arise, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And I'm all about people seeing themselves as being created in the image of God and the worth that they have. But he's right. He's not worthy to be called a son anymore. There's a fantastic apologist who is trying to address the concept of self-worth. And there's an open question and answer forum where a young guy got up and he said, you just seem really hard on people that are making mistakes. Like, people make mistakes. And the apologist said, I don't disagree that we make mistakes, but let's call things what the Bible calls things. Sin. It's called sin. And what he said next shocked the room. He said, if it weren't for the love of God, you wouldn't be worth a sack of sand. Because all of us at some point, even though we're created in the image of God, we rebel against our God. What Paul says over in Romans chapter 5 is that we are enemies of him before we come to Christ. We're openly hostile to him, whether we mean to be or not. And so when we finally humble ourselves and see that, then we can approach the Father the way that we ought to approach the Father, on our knees begging for mercy. But he's so abundant to give it. So this father who has been looking for his lost son, when he sees him coming, rushes out to meet him, embraces him, kisses him. The son only gets halfway through his speech, and he reinstates him as a full son. Kills the fattened calf. And then the older brother, who has stayed home this whole time, hears the party and asks what's been going on. Verse 27, one of the servants said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, "Look, these many years I've served you, and I've never disobeyed your command." That's a little generous, right? You know he made mistakes. He's not perfect, but he's glossing over his imperfection. "I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat." I really doubt that his dad never celebrated him. I really doubt that. But we generalize things when we're hot. "That I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours," have you ever been so frustrated with someone that you dehumanize them to the point that you don't even want to use their name? "That daughter of yours, that father of yours, that mother of yours, that neighbor," and you're dehumanizing them, you're not even going to name them. That's where these brothers were. "When this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he's found." Go back to the beginning of the chapter. All of these souls were lost, but they've been brought back. And what is heaven doing about all of this? They're celebrating. And if heaven is celebrating, then what should I be doing? Celebrating. I should be celebrating and recognizing the fact that I am one of them. Let's get through this. The lost son, and you could do a whole lesson on the father and his searching diligently. The way that he searched diligently was to let him go, looking for his return. The father respected the free will of the son. He didn't chase him down every day saying, "Hey, stop that. Hey, don't spend money on that. Hey, don't spend time with that person." I think there's a whole lesson there. The son came to himself and humbly returned, and the father rejoiced and invited others too, but the self-righteous older brother was rebuked. And do you realize when you go back and read through it that it was the self-righteous older brother that excluded himself from the celebration? He was missing out because of his bad attitude. But the father wanted him there. What are some applications that we can make? The first is this, that every soul is precious to God and should be precious to us. Every soul is precious to God. There was a congregation that I was talking to about working with them, and I met with the elders, and we were talking and trying to figure out, hey, what are you about? What are you about? And I may have said something along the lines of, so what is the congregation here about? Something like that. And it was kind of a different question, and the elders weren't prepared for that. And they thought for a minute, and then one of the elders said, "Come with me." And they went out into the foyer. And at the time, back before digital directories, there was the photo board on the wall. And that elder went through the photo board for as long as it took him and told me something about every single photo on that wall. This is this family, this is when they came here, this is what's going on with them right now, this is how many kids they have, and every single picture on that board. And when he got to the very end, he just said, "That's what we are about." Amen. Every single soul. There's another eldership that I know that one of the ways that they tried to practice that is they tried to pray as an eldership every single week for their congregation. And so what they did is they got out the directory, the old paper directories that were never updated, right? And they got them out, and they would pray through them however much at a time for 30 to 45 minutes at the same time every week, and they would stop when they needed to stop because they were working elders, and then the next week they'd pick up where they left off. And they did that every week, every year, because they were concerned for every soul in their congregation, every single soul. The reason they did those things is because God expends great effort. He goes out of his way and risks rejection in order to reach one person. We need to learn to do the same. I was encouraged to hear the things that JP mentioned this morning about the congregation here and their efforts in evangelism, reaching out to every single soul. And the main point of Luke 15 is learning to have a humble and grateful attitude so we can rejoice over every person who's reconciled with God. And in order to do that, we need to remember how much mercy we have received from the Father. Just like the older brother was like, "Hey, I never did anything wrong." That is not real. He did do things wrong, and if he had remembered that, it would have kept him humble enough to be more gracious when the brother came back. We need to remember how much mercy we have received from the Father. And Paul does a fantastic job through the epistles of stating that about himself and reminding us to do the same. I don't know the group here. I know so many people are traveling and visiting, but every single one of us needs to take stock. Where are we? Where are you with the Father? Are you one of the lost ones that needs to be found? If you are, I'm confident in saying that there are some people here who value your soul the way that God values your soul, and they will expend great effort to help to reconcile you with the Father. They just need to know. And as far as evangelism, looking for people who are still lost. But then if you are one of God's children, thinking through not being arrogant, but maintaining a humble attitude, remembering how much mercy you've received, so that when those people come back, you can celebrate. Just a couple of weeks ago at our home congregation in Louisville, there was a sweet lady who's been away from the Lord for years, and she came back. And that was exciting. And I'm so grateful for the atmosphere in the room and that she felt like this was a place that would celebrate her return. I'm confident this is a congregation that would want to do the same. If there's some way that we can meet your spiritual needs this evening, please let us know by coming forward as we stand and sing.